Okay, ciao everyone. And let me start with an image. The picture that you see here, it is one of the most famous pictures ever shot. It is actually the picture that has been circulated the most in the entire history of photography, believe it or not. It is the picture of our planet as taken for the first time by the astronauts on the Apollo 17 in the 1970s. That led to the idea of a blue planet, as you can see, dominated by our oceans. And I think that had a profound impact on everyone. It was the first time that we could see our Earth from outside. It was the first time that we realized that our planet is small and it's beautiful. And this is also a picture, believe it or not, of our future, because that's the planet where we're going to live and where our kids and grandkids we're going to be living. So let's talk about the future today, and let's talk about this planet today, because the two go hand in hand. Now, it's easy to talk about the future, the Earth. It's nice to see it on picture, and of course it gives us emotions. It led to the start of the environmental movement in the 70s. But it's very difficult to understand what can we do for the planet. How can we change our actions and our behavior in such a way that that beautiful planet remains as beautiful as it was depicted back then. Now, what can we do here, us, in a classroom, or maybe in a conference, or maybe in a room, if other, 7 billion people live outside, and this will be even more in the years to come. And I think actually the answers for how daunting and big it might sound is actually that we can do it. So let's get started first, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to think for a couple of questions. How many of you do you know how many CO2 emissions you emitted last year? Think about it. How many in the class? How many of you are vegetarian? How many of you took a plane or flight in the past year? Just do a brief counting, and then we'll go back to these same questions. Now, even if I believe many of us don't know exactly how to quantify it, we know that we do travel, we take flights, we eat meat, we eat our houses, or the houses we live in are heated. That is to say, we do emit CO2. And probably you emit as much CO2 as a normal person already, you're being as a grown-up. Now what you see in the screen now, it's an important measure. It's an artificial measure, but it's important for our talk today. This is to give you a feeling about a ball or a balloon which has 1 ton of CO2. So this is a balloon which size is the size of a ton of CO2. And 1 ton of CO2, it's a very important metric. You'll see in a second. We could stop here, and actually I invite you to do so. Go back home when you go back home, and do a carbon footprint yourself. It's easy. There are many calculators. You just web search online, carbon footprint calculator. You have a lot of them. Just do it in your family. It takes about 20 minutes to do it. We don't have now the time for doing it now, so I invite you to do it at home. But let's assume that we have an imaginary friend or a hypothetical friend, and here he comes, Jack. Jack is a friend of mine, he's a collaborator of mine and a friend of mine. And I asked him to do his carbon footprint and to calculate the carbon footprint for me. And let's have a look a little bit at what's his impact in terms of CO2 emissions. So here's Jack. Here's the scale, you see, from 0 to 12. Each unit is one of those big balloons that we saw before of 1 ton of CO2. And let's try to add them up. This is the first item that came out. How much CO2 is emitted by living in a house? Casa is Italian for house. And he emits about 1 ton of CO2 to heat the house, to light the house where he lives. And it's a very small house, by the way. So it's already one big balloon. Then he has been flying. He went to the US, I think, once, and here and there for work and also for holiday. And here we go, almost another balloon for flights. He doesn't drive very much. He doesn't have a car. Still, sometimes he drives, and he has half balloons, half ton of CO2 coming from the car. Then if you add the bus, trains, and secondary counting everything else, meaning food, meaning clothing, meaning buying products and, smartphones and cell phones and computers. He likes IT a lot, like probably many of you. Well, what you see is that his carbon footprint is about 10 tons of CO2. 10 tons of CO2, 10 of those big balloons that you saw before. And he's young. He's probably not very much older than you are. And it's more or less the same on average emissions that an average Italian or an average European emits. Now, we are not alone in this planet. There are many other people like us and many other people like Jack. And for example, Jack is here in this slide. He's emitting about 10 tons of CO2 every year. So every year is adding to the atmosphere 10 balloons of those size that you saw before. Now, of course, we are not alone. There's Chinese who emit almost as much. An average Chinese, not the president of China, which has been depicted here, whose carbon footprint is obviously much bigger, or the president of the US. But an average Chinese emits about 8 to 10 tons, or 8 to 10 tons of CO2, meaning 8 to 10 balloons of CO2. An average American is even worse. It's about twice as much. 20 balloons every year for every person that lives in the US. So go back home once you looked at this, do carbon footprint calculator, come up with a number and tell me or write me how many balloons you emit every year. And of course, as you see, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people living in China or in the world or in Asia. There's a lot of people living in the US. And there's more and more people living on the planet. On total, we emit about 40 billion tons of CO2, which means 40 billion balloons, which also means 40,000 millions balloons of those balloons. 40,000 millions balloons added to the atmosphere every year. And you see here, divided by country, China, US being the largest contributors in terms of regions, but a lot of other countries adding. India, Russia, Japan, Europe has also a big footprint. And of course, much less so countries in development. This is the picture today. It's 40 billion tons of CO2. And it's a big number. And the other bad thing is that this number is not going down. It's actually going up. As you see from this chart, showing how many balloons have been emitted in the atmosphere from 1920s of the last century till now. And you see it growing and growing. The last 10 years I've seen balloons, the rate of which balloons are emitting the atmosphere going up and up. So not only we are emitting a lot into the atmosphere, we are also emitting every year a little bit more. And you might think, okay, so what? We do that as we do many other things, and emitting 40,000 millions balloon in the atmosphere today, and maybe 50, 60,000 millions balloons in 10 years from now is not such a bad thing. Well, if you don't know about it yet, it is a bad thing, and I'm pretty sure you actually know about it well, because you certainly have heard about climate change. Climate change tells us that we are filling the atmosphere with CO2, and that's not good. You might think of a CO2, look at this chart, or the atmosphere as a bathtub. There's a certain fraction of CO2 in the atmosphere, and every year we add these 40 billion balloons into it by simply burning fossil fuels, driving around, flying, cutting down forests, and many other things. Now, luckily, Earth is very kind to us, and it's actually absorbing part of that. Between oceans, the oceans on one end, and land on the other, are absorbing about 15 billion tons of CO2. Still, there are still 20 to 25 to 30 billion tons of CO2, which are added to this atmosphere, which is a bathtub. What does it mean? That we are filling it up. Every year, we are filling it up the more so, despite the fact that Earth is helping us by taking some of that CO2 away and putting it in the oceans, down in the oceans, or down in the forest and in the soil. Yet, what we are doing is adding more and filling that bathtub up. We are already at 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a number you might have heard. It's not a big number by itself. It's 400 parts per million, which means 0.04% in the atmosphere of CO2, but it is enough for creating problems in terms of climate change, and more so in the next generation and in years to come, which means the time where you will be living in this planet and your kids will be living in this planet. 400 parts per million, it's already a big number, and we know from the science that if we go above certain numbers, that will mean that we're going to have a planet which is going to be hotter and hotter, with more complicated precipitation patterns, extreme events, flooding, and a lot of disasters, both for the men and the humans who live and will live on this planet, as well as for the animals and the planet itself. So what can we do then? Or what can you do then? Since the planet is yours more than it is mine, since you'll be living on the planet for more than I do. Well, think about Giacomo and Jack again, and, for example, changing habit drivings, or changing his car altogether, as his actual example, turning from an old Volkswagen to a hybrid car which consumes less. There are many, many ways to reduce your carbon footprint. There's not such a single way, and that's good, because different people like doing different things. You might want to stop eating meat or beef and maybe turn to chicken or turn into vegetarianism. That's a good way of doing it, but it's not the only one. You could buy renewable energy. You could drive less and bike instead of driving. You could be careful when you buy products. Look at the carbon footprint, where these products are coming from. A long distance place, or is it coming from nearby? And you can do that pretty easily. There's a lot of ways also online, if you search on the same carbon footprint, ways that you can actually undo some of the damage that everyone is doing, and you are doing as well, maybe without you knowing so well so far. One simple example how behavior can change. This is an experimentation that has been now popularized. If I show you how much you consume on something, let's say how much you consume in terms of energy at home, and I compare you with some friends, your neighbors or friends, and I tell you that you are consuming above them in a way that you're pretty bad, and I give you even a bad face sometimes, that helps, for example, helping you reduce emissions, or in this case energy, and the opposite would not help if I reward you with a smiley. That's an example of also behavioral interventions and behavioral ways to try to change our impact on our planet. And you'll see more and more of this in the years to come. Let me conclude with the same picture that where we started from. This is the same picture that led to the environmental movement in the 70s. And this is the same picture that you have to keep in mind. We would love to have a planet which has infinite resources, which has an atmosphere which is much bigger than it is. It's very large already, but much bigger than that. That has more water, that has more oil, that has more everything, and more minerals. But we don't. The fact is we don't. We live in a planet with finite resources, and it's a small planet as seen from this picture from outside, although we tend to forget about that. And we'll have to live on this planet for many years to come. Many years, many generations. With a population which is growing and living on standards which are growing, and more demand for resources. So it is up to you and the way you're going to grow and the way you're going to tell stories to your kids how this planet will turn out to be in the next 100 years. Make the best of it. Thank you.